Good morning to everyone in Europe and good afternoon to everyone in China. Welcome again to the USME Center webinar series. We're very happy to see a number of you again logging into the platform today. The platform continues to develop and we've got quite a few exciting webinars coming up to you in the next few months. I'd just like to again give you a very short overview again of the webinar panel so as to just ensure that everything's working well on the techniques. If on your panel you'll see a few functions, one of them is on the left hand side, you've got a hand, if you can just raise it so that we can actually, if everyone hearing us can raise it so we can just make sure that everything works well. Not seeing many hands being raised, but okay, it's gradually starting, so I see that the audio is working well. Amongst the other functions you have is the question panel, so throughout the webinar don't hesitate to ask us any questions or issues you'd like to see addressed during or after the webinar. And if for some reason we don't manage to take your question today, what we'll do is to make sure that we'll follow up to you after the webinar separately and also for security to get your answer. I would also suggest for those of you that are not registered on the USME Center website yet to actually register, logging and ask your question through the Ask the Expert function. So a very quick overview again about the center. The USME Center is a project funded by the European Union, and we're here to assisting European SMEs to export and develop their business and commercial activities on the Chinese market. And we're doing this through a series of free confidential information and advice to you through a number of different services and support facilities. So we're doing this in 4 different areas: business development, legal issues, standards and conformity assessment, and HR and training issues. So we're doing that through a number of different services, and most notably we have developed this webinar series just close to a year ago to just make sure that we could reach most of you back in Europe, but also in China with this information. Today we've got quite an exciting topic coming up. This is our second webinar on how to manage in China's most important resources on HR. And today we have with us Alyssa, who will try to, who will share her experience and try to make it clear to you on how to tap into the full potential of China's generation Y and Z, so the newer generation, the younger generation of workers in China. So as I mentioned, we have with us Alyssa from Management Development Services Ltd with us, MDS. And with this I'd like to give you the floor, Alyssa, to briefly introduce yourself and maybe the points that you will be covering in today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Benoit. It's a pleasure to be invited to participate and share some of what I've learned over the last 7 years here in China with all of you. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are actually in China. So initially I came over in a role as Human Capital Strategy Lead for Asia Pacific for China. And that really gave me a broad view, not just on the human capital challenges in China, but also across the region, and also a comparative view. So I'll be able to share a bit on that. Around 2 years ago, I moved to MDS, which is actually an SME. So I have more of a perspective of what it's like to be an SME in China now myself. Our founder is British, and our company started in Hong Kong, but we have one of our offices here in Beijing and one in Shanghai. And so, especially in the last 2 years, working mainly with multinationals where we provide leadership development, coaching to them, I've really gotten a better view of the specific challenges in China. In addition to that, I'm the chair of the European Chamber of Commerce in China HR Forum. And we have a series of practice sharing and community building events here to really understand and better get in depth on those challenges. So hopefully all of this experience will provide quite a bit that will also support and help some of the questions you may have. Okay, and so what we're really going to look at today, first a macro view of the biggest HR challenges in China. Then I know that from the questions that also come in to the SME Center here, there is a lot of focus on wages, also attrition, but especially wages, what trend we see. So I have some of the latest reports to share with you on that. And really also will give you a view of what we can expect looking further ahead. The next area I want to look at is Generation Y and Z in China, because this is really now the bulk of the professional talent pool that SMEs will be hiring. And so it's extremely important to understand what they really want and are looking for. And based on all of that, toward the second part of the webinar, I'll give some specific recommendations on sourcing but also retention strategies for SMEs to consider, whether you're just establishing yourself or are already established here in China.
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Just actually for the non-HR people or the non-native English speakers, I know I had the problem myself with that word. Attrition, can you just note what it means? Because I was having that challenge myself when I first saw the outline. I think it's actually the employees leaving without the position being renewed. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. That's the percentage of people who would be leaving, and that can also be whether they are being asked to leave or whether they're leaving on their own. So we call that managed or unmanaged attrition, but it's the percentage of people who end up leaving the company in a given month and given year. Usually there's a certain percent you try to aim at, 8 to 10% depending on the industry. The challenge, of course, here in China is that we find the percentages tend to be double that and double the norm in other countries. So it is a big challenge that we'll talk about.
And actually, as you say, there are quite a number of challenges. And on that, maybe I'd like to already launch the first poll just to gauge our audience on the principal challenges that they face as they are dealing with human resources in China. You should see the poll appearing on your screen just now. So yes, right now I think it should appear on your screen, so you can see that basically we're asking you what is the biggest challenge that you face regarding talents in China. Is it A, the rising wages, B, the attraction and recruitment of talent, C, retention of talent, D, the labor law changes, and finally managing expats. So I see that the answers are gradually coming in. I leave you a few more seconds to give us your answer. Okay, and with this I'm just closing and sharing the results of the polls, and here we can see, Alyssa, that really just about 50% find that the major challenge is really the attraction and recruitment of talent, and coming second with 1/3 of the audience the question of retention, and finally a lot lower, 7% respectively, questions of rising wages and labor law changes. No answers on managing expats, so that's a bit surprising actually. I don't know if you want to, if you have some comments on these particular answers.
Thank you. Yes, that is interesting. And actually, the good news is that a lot of our content today is looking at attraction and retention. So I think we'll be touching on the areas that are most important to all of you. Typically, we do see that managing expats is quite a challenge as well. And of course, there are a lot of focus and quite a bit of concern around wages, especially over the last 5 years. So just looking at the overall landscape, and this is not only specific to SMEs, of course, but I will speak about how these challenges are relevant to SMEs in particular. First, what we have on the top left when we think of globalization is a shift to a knowledge economy. So we all recognize now that China is shifting out of a manufacturing economy. And what does that really mean? That more complex skills and better leadership and management skills are needed. So we really can't just rely on mediocre leadership and management skills. And much of the research shows that so far that's really what we've had. So again, this is also important for SMEs as well as for the larger organizations and can be a point of differentiation. We talked about attrition earlier. As I said, it's 2 to 3 times as high as global averages and even high compared to some other Asian countries. So really I think as the economy softens a bit, can't necessarily rely as much on 30% increases to attract top talent. And that's something that up until now has seemed to work quite well to attract top talent in larger companies as well as SMEs. I think this is actually very good news for the SMEs because later on I will show you that if you can't rely as much on the wage increases, what are the factors that really are important to the Chinese professionals? And when we go through that, you'll see that those factors are easier for the SME to actually tap into than some of the larger organizations. So I think that this softening of the economy with larger organizations not being able to offer as big increases as they used to is actually good news for SMEs. And the third thing we have to consider are the workforce demographics. So again, Generation Y and Z are very different profiles. Even between themselves are not as similar as we think. There are also, within Generation Y in China, several different groups. I'll talk about a couple that we need as SMEs and employers to be considering and be knowledgeable about. And so, again, that understanding of those groups presents a great opportunity, and especially relevant when you're talking about attracting, which I know 50% of you say is your biggest challenge. So we'll talk more about that as well.
Okay, that's quite a few things already, and one of the points which is coming back a few times already in your speech is really the question of wages, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that just now. So before going deeper into that topic, I'd like to launch a second poll. I think our polls today are very close to one another, but let me launch this poll. So you should see the question appearing to you now. So basically what we're asking is whether you're expecting that wages, whether the wage increase in China in comparison to last year will continue, or in continuing to increase will be at a similar rate. Well, I think that the answers there are A, at a higher rate than in the past, B, at a lower rate than in the past, or C, at a same rate as in the past. So I'm getting all your answers here, and I think that, well, we're seeing quite a lot of 60% already answering that the wage increase will be similar to the one of last year. So I'm just closing and sharing the results with you now. Maybe I can. What is your impression on that, Alyssa? Maybe I can just pass on to the next slide for you to share a bit the perspective you have and how you've seen this progressing over time and what are the trends there.
Great, thank you. So generally, I think that's correct that we're similar to what we've seen over the last year with a slight decrease. And so if we look at several reports, and at the end we can mention some resources for you to look in more depth if you're interested. So according to German Chamber of Commerce's 2012 annual salary survey, wages grew by 10.2% in the previous year, and they're expected to increase by 8.1%. So a slight slowdown. That is also, the same view that we see in the Hayes salary guide, which just came out last month, where 30% of companies expect to be giving more than 10% of the increases in 2013, which is significantly higher for the region. However, last year, more than 47% gave 10% increases in China. So we do see a slight slowdown, and again, I think this could actually be good news for SMEs who are trying to attract the workers that are slightly more highly skilled workers. According to Hayes survey, the hardest areas to recruit for are sales, technical roles, accountancy, finance, and HR, all clearly very important roles, and I'm sure many of the roles that many of you are trying to fill. In terms of attrition figures, I've mentioned that they're 2 times higher than global averages. A few other data points that I think are important, which are not here, and I will mention, and we'll talk about the resources at the end of the webinar. We also have 93% of employers believing that skill shortages will hamper their business operations somehow. Again, this is based on the Hayes survey. So there's a very big concern that, okay, wages have been increasing, that's fine, but they really can't find the people with the right skills. And 68% of employers are willing to sponsor qualified overseas candidates. I thought that was quite high. Many businesses are localizing at the same time. Also, according to the Global Mobility Study, we see China as the #1 destination for expats, and at least steady or increasing number still of foreigners coming into China on expat assignments. So just to let you know, that is still a trend. We still continue to see a mix of expats and foreigners in the Chinese businesses here. Just to give you a comparison to other parts of Asia, in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, over 50% of companies are increasing 3 to 6%. So that's still far lower, than the percentage increase we see here in China as an average. And in Japan, it's less than 3%. So, relatively speaking, the increases are high, yet they're softening, certainly softening a bit. Okay, now I want to speak a bit about Generation Y, and this will link into some of the wage information as well as we go. Here we're looking at Generation Y globally, and I think it's important in the context of Generation Y to realize that there are certainly a lot of similarities. China Generation Y is unique. At the same time, there are a few key points I want to highlight which are the same if we look at what is similar globally. Number one, the direct supervisor is extremely important. That's probably the #1 thing that can keep them in an organization. Simply put, if they have a good relationship with their direct supervisor, they are far more likely to stay than if they have a bad relationship. For SMEs, I think there's a lot we can do in a more flexible and easier way to ensure that those relationships are good relationships, compared to some of the very, very large organizations where they have to put a huge amount of resource to try to get their managers to have that good relationship. So I think that's one point. Second point is flexibility, and we'll look more at this. Generation Y globally, we know flexibility is extremely important. And so again, that's an area where as SMEs, I think there's more room to actually allow flexibility. There are not as many rigid processes, structures in place. And I have some data on the flexibility currently, which actually there's more flexibility in organizations than you would expect already here in China. So if you don't have that built into your organization, that's something that you definitely want to make sure you do have. Finally, in general, Generation Y don't want to be told what to do. And this is, I think, a very big challenge because, especially with the Western mindset, we come in having some stereotypes around Chinese employees, and often they do want a lot of guidance and structure, and we interpret that as them wanting to be told what to do. And so I think this is a point where really we will differentiate that you can provide a lot of structure and guidance without necessarily telling people what to do, and that can be a much more effective approach.
Maybe just a quick question here, Alyssa. I mean, typically, and maybe this is not a stereotype, but a lot of our European SMEs, because they are small, they also have more flexibility and in their adaptation. And so, looking at what you just said, do you think that this is really one of the assets and one of the advantages that SMEs have compared to other employers, larger employers in China, in recruitment of staff here?
Absolutely. I think that SMEs have quite a bit of opportunity to quickly adjust their culture for their China operation, to create a more flexible culture, perhaps a culture that's more family-like, which we've seen can be very effective. For larger multinational organizations, that can be very difficult to achieve. For the large SOEs, which are also competing for the top talent these days, we see that they have so much hierarchy and rigidity in place, I'll talk about this more, that for them it's very difficult to provide the flexibility, or it takes a very long time to get just one flexible practice in place. Mm-hmm. So this is clearly a big area of advantage where SMEs can consciously say, we're going to make a more flexible work environment, we're going to find the culture that attracts this group of people, this group of employees, and they can put that into practice quite quickly. And we're seeing that that really works. It works to attract people and it works to retain people. And I'll talk more specifically about how to do it as we go.
Well, that's great. Thank you. So moving on.
So Generation Y in China, more specific now, over 50% of the working age population, really close to 60%. Although they hold many traditional values, they're beginning to challenge the preeminence of hierarchy. So the biggest mistake we can make as Western managers is to come in assuming that the traditional cultural type of a Chinese professional applies to Generation Y. It doesn't. For example, our traditional Chinese type would be high on hierarchy, expecting and wanting a lot of hierarchy. That is no longer the case. When university students are polled now, they're coming out middle to low on hierarchy. Also on another factor around independence, they're coming out much higher on independence. So we really see a challenge and a change in this, and so we need to really be aware, try not to come in with an expectation as Western managers. They are the most highly educated generation in China. What's very different and unique is that this is the only generation of one child, only children in the whole world. It's an unprecedented phenomenon. And so as these only children grow up, we see that the phenomenon has certainly created certain patterns that are important to the workplace. They have very high IQs. Many are considered gifted and can be perfectionists. And at the end, we'll also mention this resource for Nandini Linton at Sieves, the research she has done. Globally, there's a lot of research on Generation Y. Here in China, it's very limited, in fact, so there's more in progress. But from what we can see so far, this very high IQ creates a paradox because it's almost as if they are really needing a huge amount of guidance, are not independent. So they're really looking to their manager for everything. At the same time, though, again, they don't want to be told what to do. So I think this creates a big, really conundrum for managers to see how do I manage in an effective way when on the one hand, they want a huge amount of guidance, and on the other hand, they don't want to be told what to do. And the answer is really to maybe move into some new ways of managing and certainly not rely on a command and control style approach, which is often what we revert into when we don't know what to do, just giving a lot of instructions and kind of orders. We see that that may work in the short term. It doesn't really work to attract and retain employees here anymore. Okay, and so more evidence of the fact that that doesn't work is a recent study looking at engagement levels. And generally, engagement levels in China tend to not be very high. And specifically, we can see that there's quite a big group who are underengaged or not engaged. So when considering what's interesting about this study, what culture of the organization actually has those who are more engaged, moderately or highly engaged, and that is an enterprising culture. So it's not just a sort of laid back, you don't have to work hard, laissez-faire culture, which we would consider social or dependable. And it's also not hierarchical. In fact, the hierarchical culture fared the worst. So this is probably not very good news for the SOEs. And in fact, it's very good news for the SMEs, because certainly we will typically see more of an enterprising culture in SMEs. What do we mean by an enterprising culture? It's a bit entrepreneurial. You feel that you have a stake. You feel that there's opportunity for creativity, that you're maybe bringing something new to the market. It's a quite hard-working and ambitious culture. So this is really where the Chinese professionals are much more engaged today. Another advantage that SMEs can bring and really try to spread word of mouth about how you can bring this to Chinese professionals is the opportunity for them to really build some global skills. And there is increasing awareness among Chinese professionals that this is something that is important. Whether they want to leave China or stay in China, this is something that is becoming more and more important. And in the recent summer Davos in Tianjin in 2012, less than a year ago, this report really gave the evidence here that not just for China, but for the BRIC countries, and especially for China, we see that the most important future skills for managers, this is not senior leaders, this is actually managers, will be the ability to manage a diverse employees, so that may mean diverse across China, or also diverse with virtual teams managing people outside of China, and also the understanding of international markets. So really, this doesn't even necessarily mean that they will be traveling, and actually to be able to offer them this feeling that they're increasing their global mindset and their global skills doesn't mean that you need to post them overseas. It means that you need to have a value or a culture that lets them know they will be able to increase their understanding of international markets and their understanding of diversity, their ability to manage diversity by working for your organization. And I think that for many SMEs, there's a natural and easy way to convey those messages and create actual project or work opportunities where they have this interaction. They have interaction with a diverse team, of course, people back in headquarters, etc. So that needs to be leveraged more, and again, can be seen as a differentiator, especially in state-owned enterprises. There really is much more limited opportunity for them to gain these kind of global skills.
If you're comparing it, Alyssa, to what we see here from other markets like Brazil, Russia, and India, you've got other elements which are not coming out, coming out as specifically as the three elements you mentioned now, like for example questions of foreign language skills as one of the elements. Is this, however, maybe another opportunity for SMEs maybe to think of retaining staff through trainings and training of foreign languages, for instance, just to pick on this particular element?
Absolutely. I think there can be more that SMEs do. Sometimes we assume or hear that the Chinese employee is not particularly interested, say, in moving or working abroad. However, any chance, it can be language, it can be global business understanding, understanding of global operations and markets, hugely important. Not just cross-cultural understanding. Cross-cultural understanding is quite basic. And when we look at global leaders who are very effective, that's one small piece. There are a lot of other informational pieces, and then of course the softer side of managing diverse employees, being able to build bridges of understanding with people from different backgrounds. That's hugely important. And so I think SMEs can be more systematic in providing that kind of development in addition to sort of language training and and I think, it's a combination of training, experience, coaching, where you can really be building this global skill set for them, and that's becoming really attractive.
Another way then for SMEs to differentiate themselves really on the market. Thank you.
So another interesting study, we can mention this in the resources as well, is the Greater China and Singapore Talent Environment Report from MRI China. And in that report, I think what was very interesting is that they looked at what could attract and motivate people to stay in their job, other than the money, the salary. And so, in fact, this generation is more likely to weigh these other factors, especially the Generation Z, the younger, weigh the other factors more. So it's really becoming easier to leverage the other factors. Of course, the money is still important. It's becoming easier to really leverage these other factors as well. So the top three were the opportunity to increase responsibility and challenge. And this, again, is counterintuitive. Often, as Western managers, when we see someone who is needing a lot of guidance, and especially as only children growing up with many advisors, their adults, parents, grandparents, I think there's a natural tendency to look for a huge amount of support and guidance. When we see someone looking for that, we often interpret it as them not wanting to take on more responsibility. And I think that's a big mistake. So number one here, taking on more responsibility and challenge, isn't that wonderful news for everybody, all kind of organizations? Clearly, I think we're missing something in really making the connection and tapping into that need to take on more responsibility and challenge. Second, a better company culture and people. Again, as we mentioned, this is an area where SMEs can be doing a lot. And I think sometimes the challenge for the SME is we just try to put all the administrative pieces in place, and we don't take the time to build the company culture. And this is really probably the biggest factor where the SME can differentiate. And third, better work-life balance, again, around flexibility. So again, on our first point, this is really aligning with the point about the enterprising culture, keeping people more engaged. Allowing more flexibility is something you need to make sure you can do, and I think deliberately shaping your culture for your China operation. It can be different than the culture you have in your headquarters, and this is something that's probably the most powerful advantage, something that the multinational can easily do, the SME can easily do compared to the multinational. Having worked for many years in a multinational and having worked on culture globally with that team, what I really learned is that it's difficult to break out of the global culture of a very large organization. So often the multinational will try to use that global culture to their advantage. However, I think as an SME, really you don't have that very strong and prevalent global culture necessarily. So you have more opportunity to deliberately shape your culture for what you want to achieve locally. And so Generation Z may be something many of us haven't even really thought about. And this is the post-90s, those born after 1990. There are some interesting articles here in China already differentiating the post-80s, approximately, which are our Generation Y and Z. I think, again, similarities here, but what are a few things that are different? Really, the mobile devices, okay? Even more than Generation Y, mobile devices are extremely important. And so I think don't try to control laptops, allowing people to use their own laptops, having flexibility around that, not trying to control their actual interactions on social media at work time. I think there does need to be some monitoring and control around social media. However, what we see clearly is that trying to overly control or ban any of this is really something that's going to work very much against the organization. So, some of the more rigid organizations already are seeing that that's really working against them in trying to attract and retain people.
I'd like to maybe ask you a question here, Alyssa. This is also because it's related to one of the questions that came in a bit earlier. And we're talking here about trying to avoid rigid environments and trying to provide more flexibility, letting people use their own mobile devices. Yet on some aspects, and I'm thinking about intellectual property protection, for instance, a lot of organizations in China have decided to try to have very rigid structures where people cannot take in USB sticks or their other mobile devices to avoid leaking out of information, or whether willingly or unwillingly. Sometimes it's, I'm thinking about some platforms like Baidu Encyclopedia, where people upload documents because it's giving them credits which they can exchange for products, etc. How would you deal with this dilemma of having more flexibility whilst on the other hand also maintaining a secure environment for your data and information?
That's a very good point, thank you. I would say that an approach of really trying to strictly limit the use of devices is the opportunity cost is probably going to outweigh the benefit. So there's much more to lose in terms of losing probably the most creative, dynamic employees of the younger generation who will just go to another organization where they have more freedom, frankly. So what I would recommend in trying to manage the risk is to have things like simple training on raising awareness of what is and is not appropriate to say or share online. Have some policies which, for the items that are quite critical and risky, certainly there are expectations set on penalties. And so that it's not a completely open and free-flowing anything goes. I think some rules do need to be set, some boundaries need to be set. However, I would carefully consider setting those boundaries in a way that still provides a sense of freedom, because I think when it's the sense of freedom that's feeling lost for this particular group of people is where they will just go to another organization where they can get the freedom.
So the challenge of setting the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Thank you.
Another big point here is variety. The attention span, I think it also has to do with the rise of technology, is limited, and so having this younger generation do the same repetitive job day in, day out, of course in some cases we need to do that, but figuring out ways to also include some variety in their job. Ongoing encouragement is extremely important. I think this is, there's general neuroscience data that says people, in order to be productive in a work environment, need at least 5 times more positive encouragement from their boss compared to any kind of criticism. I think this is amplified for this generation because of some of the points I mentioned before. They really need a lot of positive feedback in order to perform well. And so we have to be very careful in the critical feedback, the constructive feedback that's provided, how to do it in the right way. And finally, they're the most environmentally aware generation. This is the first, even compared to Generation Y. Generation Z are far more environmentally aware. And so that can be another way, especially if your SME is focused on any kind of sustainable or environmental product, service, etc., that you really will be able to attract more people in this younger group.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the leadership style that's required if you're a manager, if you're a leader, if you're the owner of the business, to really be able to attract these bright young people? What is going to enable you to also retain them and also set your business up for success going forward in China? So I think that there's a really interesting study here by Korn Ferry, which looks at 4 leadership styles: executor, the controller, the energizer, and the integrator. And as you look at this, maybe just consider whether in your own market or where you come from in the world, which styles you think are currently being used the most. And yeah, I think we actually have another poll here.
Yes, so, well, I think you've had time to just look at the different characteristics of these different leadership styles. So what we'd like to poll you on is really, engage you on is really to see what you believe is the leadership style now to be applied in China. So you've got different styles here. We've got A, energizers, B, controller, C, integrator, and D, executor. So I'm seeing that the answers are coming in. Just going to give you a few more seconds. Seems like two of the categories are coming out more than the others. Okay, with this I'm just closing the poll. And as you can see, Alyssa, I think, well, almost half of the participants would say that controller would be the right model. Coming second, executor with 30%, and then at an equal level, energizer, integrator. Let's see what you have to tell us and share with us on that, of what is the right leadership style to be applied in China then.
Great, yeah. So if we look here at the actual leadership style required for China, you'll see that currently we do have, I think you're all correct, the current style is first executor as primary and controller secondary. However, when we look at the global best in class and clearly what we need to shift to in order to continue on the growth trajectory that China aspires to continue on, the energizer and integrator of leadership style are needed. So as SMEs, again, if you have this realization and can look at all this research and really be convinced that this is what's going to work in the future, you can be an early adopter. You can really, in China, adopt a more integrator, energizer leadership style. It may seem different. It may be take a period of adjustment for people who are used to an executor and controller style. However, the evidence now is just so clear that this is what's going to work. These are the businesses in China that will be able to continue growth and will be the most successful, that have this kind of leadership style. So I think that's something that really needs to be considered carefully. And that also ties into the next point on innovation. Really, all of this is essential not only to keep an operation running efficiently. It's also essential that you will have innovator potential, people who will be able to take your company, whether it's a product or a service that you're offering, to the next level here in China. There are two research studies here which basically show us that when it comes to innovator potential, China is not doing terrible. At the same time, it's also really not doing very well, somewhere in the middle. So you see on the left, the SHL talent report shows us that mainland China were at 5.7% compared to 11.1, 10.6, 11.5 for some of the top countries when it comes to innovator talent, the supply of talent that we consider more innovative. And also on the right, the MRG Group Leadership Effectiveness Analysis. And sorry, this is funnily enough comparing Mexico and China because they seem to have a very similar profile. But what we see here on strategic, if you look from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over, that's one leadership capability. Strategic is there around 50%. And certainly we would want to see it at 60, 70, 75%, which is where it is in some of our more developed countries, in order to feel that we're on the right track. So this leadership style, which I was mentioning before, is also essential in order to enable more innovator potential in your SME, in order to really tap and unlock that innovation in those Generation Y and Z staff that you'll have. So just one more reason to do it. And I want to mention, for those who are in China, will be visiting China, that the European Chamber will be having a conference on this topic on the 7th of June It's our annual Human Capital Conference in Beijing, and the topic will be unlocking innovation with innovation experts, CEOs, business leaders, as well as HR professionals sharing a full day on this topic, and we'll be able to provide more information at the end. So, I think we can move on now to our talent sourcing strategies. Now, when it comes to, again, attracting talent, which is what 50% of you were most concerned about, I think in order here, what SMEs can be doing, number one is deliberately setting up a culture that is enterprising, a coaching culture that really helps to unlock the potential in people, a flexible culture. I have a statistic here, 24% of companies in the Hayes study this year said that they employ, this is not my flexibility point. Actually, it's a point on temporary staff, which I'll mention in a moment. But generally, the flexibility point is that around 60% of companies are actually providing some kind of either part-time working from home arrangement or flexible working hours arrangement. So that's quite high. Sometimes we think in China there's no flexible working. In fact, there is. So again, you can be ahead of the game, and you have probably more room to do this than some of the big multinationals, or the SOEs certainly. So that's a differentiator. Utilizing search engine optimization in social media. We had an event last month with LinkedIn, Weibo, Tianji. Tianji is under the Viadio group, new Chinese professional social network. And so again, for attracting Chinese professionals who may not even speak English, this is a very good network. I think there are some other forums and events that go into this topic, but I'm putting it very high on the list. It's essential. Another thing to consider, which I don't see enough people leveraging enough, is an excellent talent pool of newly graduated foreigners who speak perfect Chinese. They've been here 4 to 6 years studying. They're really looking for interesting work and having difficulty actually finding it. And there's some resources around that. So this is an excellent pool which SMEs should be tapping more. Also, I would recommend approaching passive talent pools rather than taking the typical approach of putting in ads and waiting for people to send in CVs. So whether it's through LinkedIn or other sources, really go out and look for the people you want rather than waiting for them to come to you. That's really what all the multinationals are doing now, and it takes some effort, but it's not as hard as we think. Finally, using temporary workers. This was my data point that 24% employ temporary staff on a regular basis, 42% for special projects, and 34% in exceptional circumstances only. So generally we have a huge group who are using temporary workers, and there's some changes in the labor law around that, and there's a webinar I'm going to mention to you in case you haven't seen it. But still, temporary workers are a very good source, which as SMEs can provide us some flexibility. Okay, and on to our retention strategy. So once we have attracted and found the right people, how can we make sure that they stay? Especially in an SME, I think one of the biggest pitfalls to succeeding is to have an inconsistent team in place. If you only have, let's say, 10 or 20 employees, if half of them are turning over every year, it's whatever else you do right, it's almost impossible for your operation to succeed. So I think moving away from the attitude of why don't they do it like I did it, when we think of the younger generation, really there's a lot of frustration that not just Western but Chinese managers have with this younger generation. I think we need to move past that frustration and really look at how can we bring out their full potential, because they do have a lot to offer. Providing an inspiring vision, values, and role models is going to create that culture that they're looking for. Ongoing guidance, but also not giving orders. I think this is a tricky one. So being there, giving answers, giving support, rather than giving orders, which means using a coach-like approach, listening, asking them more questions, talking less. So it doesn't mean to just leave and come back a month later. It does still require spending time, but a different kind of time. It's listening rather than telling and asking rather than telling. Providing the opportunity to develop a global mindset early, so figuring out how you can do that as an SME, the flexibility we've talked about, and finally the embracing social media and finding ways to increase innovation and engagement through social media, actually. And there's some ways that are not that difficult to actually do this.
Just here, I'd like to ask a question on, well, it's something that has been referred also through as a question here through the webinar. Costs, costs in first-tier cities such as Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, etc., and Shanghai are constantly increasing. And in my direct environment, while surrounding, I see quite a few young talents which decide to actually go back to their hometowns as they are trying to develop, as they're setting up families just because of the reduced cost. Is this something you see more as a challenge? Is it an opportunity? We were talking a little bit about the use of mobile devices and internet and flexi-time, etc. Is this something that companies can think of when working with their employees that are going back to different locations, or have you any experience on that, or do you see it really more as a challenge of which is contributing to this turnover in companies?
Thank you. Yes, of course, with the inflation over the last few years, this is becoming a very real challenge. I think it also, your point highlights that we shouldn't just, although I've been talking about Generation Y and Z in China generically, we shouldn't group them all into one bucket. In fact, there are differences. For example, Generation Z children of migrant workers in China who are now entering, have gone to university and are entering the professional working world. Their expectations are different, and so depending on who we're trying to attract, which group within, we may be doing things a bit differently. What I would recommend is that blended packages, so for example, maybe offering some kind of different insurance and benefits can go a much longer way, because as the tier one living does become more expensive, there's some essential things that are now needed by these young families, and offering a couple of these things in addition to your basic salary cash, I think can actually be very appealing. So looking at blended packages, and again also flexibility can go a very long way for young families with children, if they're able to then somehow manage the cost of childcare more effectively as well. It can make a difference. But really understanding which population you are trying to attract, depending on which roles you're trying to fill, is important, because the needs are not necessarily the same across, of course, all of Generation Y and Z. Yeah.
Okay, so there is a bit of homework there to try to increase the understanding, and I think you've been mentioning quite a few resources, and there's a few more resources also on our website, which I'll mention later. So on to the China labor contract law and changes upcoming.
Yes, I don't want to get into this. This is really a whole other topic, really just to raise awareness for those who don't know that in July 2012, there were amendments to the China labor contract law. They have to do a lot with temporary workers. So there are some changes there, also limiting the amount of time that companies can officially have temporary workers. If we move to a couple other areas in the labor contract law, exit and entry admission. Also, there's some changes on labor disputes, benefits for female employees actually being enhanced, so that's quite good, and for overtime regulation. What I will do is refer you to another webinar that is available on the EU SME site, and that one is called How to Manage China's Most Important Resource, Legal Challenges, where we have an expert, a legal expert, actually going into more detail on all of these. So if this is something you really need to understand better, please go ahead and take a look at that webinar. So just to summarize and conclude, I think there's a broader context of what we see happening in organizations globally. that we really need to apply also as SMEs here in China. We need to avoid thinking of stereotypes of Chinese employees, especially as we deal with this now new and very different group of people who are making up the Chinese professional realm. We need to leverage the flexibility and freedom of an SME as the biggest differentiator. If we're moving to this more global empowerment, trust-based management, open, innovative way, certainly you immediately can imagine that SMEs will have some advantage to being agile, to being more open, and offer an experience of global operating skills and learning to Chinese staff. I think these are some of the things that sound complex, but they're simple practices that an SME can put in place to actually make a difference. And really what we're seeing also from the reaction from some employees is that these things can make a very big difference to finding great, talented people and keeping them in your organization.
Thank you, Alyssa. I think that's quite a bit of food for thought. I think this is, well, I mean, we've seen throughout that managing Generation Y, managing Generation Z, there is quite a bit of also, dilemmas and how to actually find the right balance between different elements, and we've been going into quite a bit of detail on that. What I'd like to ask, and I think you've been referring to that a little bit already during the webinar, is whether there are any additional particular resources or tools or recommendations you'd like to give to today's participating SMEs to this webinar on what to do next, elements that can help them, again, as said, in terms of resources or maybe in terms of some contacts.
Sure. We have, I believe, already available, you've got on the SME site, the EU SME site, the German Chamber's 2012 salary study. I would also recommend the Hayes 2013 salary guide. I would recommend the 2012 MRI China Talent Environment Report as something to look at and consider. Also, I think a couple of the very short papers on the research on Generation Y from Nandali Linton are very useful to consider. And finally, we have an article from the Eurobiz here in China from last year on the changing face of leadership in China, which reinforces some of the points, key themes in the last year's conference on leadership and transformation here in China. So I think all of those can be great additional resources, both for data points around salaries, but also on some of the softer skills that we see that will be needed, especially when it comes to attracting the right people. And I believe that we can put more information about that on the EU SME Center site.
Absolutely, and also in addition, there's, well, you mentioned also some of the resources we have on the website, also including the webinar on the legal challenges, and there's also a series of guidelines and reports available on that, which are really providing how-to guides to SMEs to managing the legal challenges of their HR in China. That's been very, very useful, and thank you very much for sharing your experience and on how to manage the expectation of Generation Y and Z, Alyssa. I think we've got a few more minutes. We've had also an additional few questions. I think a lot of the questions that were referred to during the webinar actually were answered during a number of your slides. We have, however, a few other questions, and one is one that I see in the number of questions is really relating to what the expectations you have in terms of the development of trends over the next few years. You've touched briefly on that, but these rates of attrition and wage increase, do you see that these will? How do you see this to change in the long term? Do you see that this is, if this is changing in drastic ways, it's still an opportunity for SMEs, or HR is becoming more of a challenge when SMEs have to decide on the geographical location of their internationalization? A lot of the SMEs that are participating to our webinars, but also that are referring to us on questions, are not yet have not yet decided on coming to the Chinese market or another market. So looking specifically at the HR issue, you still see that to be an opportunity, or is it becoming more of a challenge on this market compared to other markets?
Sure, yeah. I think the trend will be that we'll continue to see a softening in the rate of increase of wages. However, it won't be a sudden decrease. So I think very much mirroring the overall economic context, we expect that as the economy is continuing to have a slightly slower but steady growth, so we'll see with wages a slightly slower set of increases, but still remaining at around 8% as an average. And so what does that mean? Certainly that's generally good news for businesses overall. It does mean that it's harder to, you have to put more work into trying to create a culture with the right, a company with the right environment. It's not just going to be the money that you can use to attract, and that's good news. For SMEs considering entering the Chinese market, I think it very much depends on whether it's a product or service and how sophisticated. So for products and services where you're looking to really have an operation that will also have some component of research and development or a component of really being a bit more innovative to sell within this market, I think that it's still opportunity, an area of opportunity. Certainly if the key driver is low wages and having an employee base that is really number one priority to be very low cost, then I think China starts to become less attractive. So really, yes, you know, for those looking only at wage level, I think less attractive. For those looking to expand their operation within China, attract the Chinese consumer, still an area of opportunity, and maybe for the SME, a chance now that wages increases are softening a bit to use your other strengths to really attract people and get an advantage over the state-owned enterprises certainly, and even the multinationals.
Okay, but still quite a few opportunities then. And then maybe we have time for just one last question, which is related to one of your points on tapping on the pool of foreign graduated students that have a very good level of Chinese language. And the question is really on whether, on why this is happening. What is the reason for that in your experience? And also how is that developing with the new labor law? Because my understanding is also that there are more restrictions on the well, technically becoming more difficult to actually employ foreign employees on questions of visa or the experience which is required from foreigners to obtain a working visa in China. Is that a little bit the reason, and how can one overcome that challenge and tap into that resource as you mentioned?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the number one reason is kind of lack of awareness. It's a tendency to think if we need Chinese-speaking young professional, we'll hire someone Chinese, it will be cheaper. And while that's probably true, the salary expectation for a young foreigner who speaks fluent Chinese may be slightly higher. However, at the same time, if they're not being sent as an expat, you know, certainly it's nowhere near the package and salary expectation you have when you're trying to bring foreigners over. So I think really how to work through, there are some additional hoops. The visa you mentioned, you know, certainly there's some additional costs like social insurance. The social insurance law came into effect in 2011 for all foreigners. However, again, the opportunity cost I think outweighs. The benefits certainly far outweigh the additional hoops and some additional costs that you have. So it's definitely a talent pool that if you're not looking at that, you should be certainly considering it more seriously, especially for SMEs.
Thank you, Alyssa. I think that's all the time we have today for answering these questions. But again, we'll get back to you separately for the additional questions we've received. Thanks a lot, Alyssa, for sharing your experience. I think this is certainly one of the areas where SMEs have quite a lot of questions and maybe where they see more of the challenges of entering the market, but as you mentioned also for SMEs in particular, there are also opportunities and ways that they can actually well, use their nature as an SME to really actually attract talent on this market. So thanks for that, and also thank you for all participants in today's webinar. I'd like to invite all of you to stay connected to the center. As I mentioned, we've got a lot of different webinars coming up in the weeks to come, and we're also available through the website where you can also send us any further inquiries you would have on this or other areas of expertise. And we're also available through social media to stay connected on updates and publications of the center. So with this again, thanks a lot, Alyssa. Thanks to everyone to participate. I'd like to remind you that the webinar will be followed by a short survey, and we'd very much welcome your feedback to continue improving the platform. So again, thanks to everyone, and we see you next week for the next webinar, which will focus on shaping the right marketing mix in China. Thank you.